She was just a scared little girl, silenced by a cruel stepmother and a father who turned away. But one morning, the family horse did the unthinkable. He stood in the doorway and refused to move. That single act of quiet defiance cracked open a path to freedom, healing, and a legacy of hope that would echo through countless lives. This is the story of how stillness can save, of how one horse changed everything, not with noise or violence, but with the simple power of staying. She was 11 the first time she realized her father wasn't going to stop it. Not then, not ever. He had been standing at the sink, rinsing his hands beneath the cold stream of well water, while Clara, her stepmother, tore into her over a chipped plate. One plate, an old one, already cracked, dropped by accident when Ella's two small fingers had slipped on the dishcloth. The ceramic had shattered against the stone floor with a sound that still echoed in her head long after it had been swept away. Clara's voice had risen sharp as a whip, words slicing clean and practiced, useless, ungrateful, always in the way. Ella had stood there, cheeks burning, hands damp, eyes locked on her father's back. He hadn't turned around, not once, not even when Clara reached out and shoved her shoulder hard enough to send her stumbling into the table's edge. That night, in the drafty loft above the stable where she slept, Ella lay curled on a bed of old quilts, staring at the wooden beams above. She counted the knots in the ceiling, listening to the low, rhythmic breath of the horse below her. Her father's house wasn't big, but it was solid. A farmhouse set deep into the Tennessee hills, surrounded by fenced pasture and fields that bent beneath wind and time. Her mother had once called it their forever place. Now it didn't feel like it belonged to her at all. After her mother died, everything shifted. Her father had changed first, gone quiet, hollow-eyed, the grief hollowing him from the inside like termites in an old beam. Clara came 6 months later, full of sharp smiles and perfume that clung to curtains long after she left the room. They married quick, too quick. Ella hadn't understood at the time, but she did now. He was lonely. He wanted the noise of another person. Clara gave him noise, just not the kind that made anything feel fuller. Ella never called her mom. Clara made sure of that. Each day began with silence and ended with scolding. She was either too slow or too loud, too clumsy or too invisible. She swept the floors, fed the chickens, helped in the garden, until her hands blistered and her back ached, and still Clara found something to criticize. Her father noticed. He had to, but he never said anything, just looked away. Only one soul on the whole farm didn't seem to expect anything from her. August. The horse had been her mother's, a tall, broad-shouldered buckskin gelding with eyes the color of creek water, and a patience that never wavered. He was 16 years old now, his muzzle turning gray, but he still stood proud in the pasture, his ears twitching toward every sound, every voice. Ella had been 4 when she first rode him, her mother's arms wrapped tight around her middle. She remembered the smell of sun-warmed hay and leather, the steady creak of the saddle, the way August had moved like he could never be rushed. He had never once bucked, never once flinched. He had simply carried her. He still did. Most nights, after Clara went to bed and her father sat hunched in his armchair, staring at nothing, Ella would sneak out through the side door and tiptoe down to the barn. August always greeted her with a soft whinny, pressing his heavy head against her shoulder as if to say, "I know. I'm here." Sometimes she climbed up onto the hayloft and read aloud to him, old library books with worn covers and dog-eared pages. Sometimes she just talked, about school, about the way her chest ached when she walked into a room and Clara's voice fell into sudden, suspicious silence. About the letter she had written to her grandmother in Georgia, but never sent. August listened. He didn't need to speak to understand. One day in early April, Clara took her into town for groceries. Ella had been dragging her feet through the cereal aisle when Clara's voice hissed low in her ear. Stand up straight. You walk like you're ungrateful." She'd straightened without thinking. Later, at the checkout counter, Clara slapped her wrist with the back of her hand for dropping a can of tomatoes. It didn't hurt much, but the cashier flinched. A woman with tight braids and soft eyes, who narrowed her gaze and said sharply, "Is everything okay here?" Clara smiled. "Too wide." "Of course, just a little clumsy today, aren't you, Ella?" Ella didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, back at the farm, Clara dragged her out of bed by the arm. Said she'd embarrassed her. Said she'd made her look like the kind of woman who couldn't control a child. Ella didn't cry. She hadn't cried in months. She just stared at the floor, the old rug worn threadbare under her toes, and tried not to flinch when Clara pushed her into the wall. The next morning, her shoulder throbbed. She winced as she forked hay into August's stall. He stood perfectly still while she worked, his dark eyes fixed on her with a kind of knowing that made her chest ache worse than her bruises. He didn't nudge her like usual, didn't demand an apple or nose through her pockets. He just watched. The next week, things got worse. Ella got a C on a history quiz, and Clara tore the paper into pieces and left them in her cereal bowl. She'd forgotten to pick the green beans before they went tough, and Clara locked the refrigerator that night, said if she couldn't do her chores right, she didn't need dinner. Her father never looked up from his newspaper. That night, she lay in the loft, too hungry to sleep, too tired to cry. Below, August shifted in his stall. The old boards creaked softly under his hooves. She whispered to him, "I don't know what to do. I don't know how much longer I can stay." He snorted, low and deep. She rolled onto her side and pressed her face into the quilt. The next morning, everything changed. And it started with August. He wasn't in his stall when she came down at dawn. That had never happened before, not once. August had always been there, standing just left of center, where the light from the small loft window spilled onto the straw. But this morning, the stall door hung open slightly, and the straw inside was barely disturbed. Ella's breath caught in her throat. The latch wasn't broken, and Clara didn't know the habit of double-checking it the way Ella did. She'd made it part of her nightly routine. Every single night, latch the stall, check the gate, count the bales. She hurried through the barn, shoving open the heavy side door and stepping out into the cold spring air. The sky was still pale, only just beginning to warm with the promise of sunrise. The pasture spread wide before her, heavy with mist. And in the middle of it, standing perfectly still, was August. He wasn't grazing, wasn't wandering. He stood facing the house, as if he were watching it. Ella moved toward him. He didn't turn his head. She paused beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and followed his gaze. The house looked ordinary in the early light. White paint curling slightly around the windowsills, the porch roof sagging at the edge, a single lamp still burning in the kitchen. She stared at it, then looked back at August. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. He didn't answer, of course, but he stepped forward, and then another step, and then, very deliberately, began to walk toward the house. Ella followed. It felt like sleepwalking. Her bare feet left soft prints in the dewy grass, her breath turning into fog. August's hooves made no sound, even on the gravel. He moved like he had always belonged there, as if he had every right to stand on the porch, as if the world itself had given him permission. He stopped at the foot of the steps and waited. Ella stared at him. "Do you want to go inside?" she whispered. He didn't move, but he didn't leave either. She walked up the steps. The door was unlocked. Clara always forgot to latch it when she was tired. Ella turned the knob and opened it just wide enough to slip through. The kitchen was warm and still. The overhead light buzzed faintly. A single plate sat on the counter with crumbs still clinging to its rim. Clara's purse was draped over the chair. Her jacket hung crooked on the back. The scent of burnt toast lingered in the air, mingled with something sharp and bitter, Clara's perfume. Ella crossed the kitchen slowly and peered into the living room. Her father wasn't there. His newspaper still lay folded on the armrest. The lamp beside the couch was on. She turned toward the hallway. Clara's voice rang out sharp as a gunshot. "What are you doing up?" Ella froze. Clara stepped into the hallway, her hair pulled back, slippers scuffing against the floor. Her eyes were already narrowed, mouth twisted. "You think you can sneak around before chores? You think this house runs itself?" Ella opened her mouth, but the sound that followed wasn't hers. It was a creak from the porch, and then the unmistakable sound of a hoof. Ella turned, and Clara's eyes followed. August stood in the doorway, framed by the soft gold light behind him. Not wild, not frantic, still, deliberate. Clara took a step back. "What the—" August stepped forward, and with one massive, slow, terrifying motion, he planted his front hoof on the threshold and bared his teeth. It wasn't a neigh, not exactly. It was a sound Ella had never heard from him before. Low, guttural, warning. Clara stumbled. She reached out, grabbing the doorframe for balance, and August stepped forward again. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Ella didn't move. August didn't move either. He stood there, still as stone, and stared at her stepmother with a force that felt ancient, immovable. He made no sound now, just breathed. Heavy, deep, like the earth itself had drawn breath. Clara turned to Ella. "What the hell did you do to that animal?" Ella didn't answer, because she hadn't done anything. She knew that now. August had done this on his own. He had opened the latch, walked to the house, waited. Clara backed up into the hallway, her hand clutching the doorframe. "Get him out of here," she hissed. "Now!" Ella stepped forward. She didn't touch August. Didn't need to. He turned slowly and walked back outside. Ella followed, the door swinging closed behind them. On the porch, she looked up at him. He blinked at her, and something inside her, something that had been curled tight and cold for so long, unfolded. It didn't stop there. That day, Clara barely spoke a word. Ella went about her chores with a quietness that wasn't fear. It was watching, waiting. That evening her father came home late, smelled like whiskey, eyes cloudy. Clara said nothing to him, just looked at Ella once, then turned and walked into the bedroom. The next morning, August stood at the fence line, watching. Ella climbed the gate and sat beside him in the grass. She began to talk, not the way she had before, not softly, not in whispers. She spoke the truth, out loud, about the slaps, the locked refrigerator, the bruises that never quite healed. And August listened. For a week, she told him everything. And at the end of that week, something happened, something she never expected. A car pulled into the driveway, not a neighbor, not the feed man, a county vehicle. And behind it, a second car. From school. Ella was called outside. And standing beside the county car was the woman from the grocery store, the cashier. Her name was Linda. She had filed a report, and someone had followed up. Ella stood frozen on the porch, hands clenched at her sides, her heart hammering like it wanted out of her chest. Linda, the woman from the store, gave her a gentle smile, but it wasn't pitying. It was the kind of smile someone gave when they already knew a secret you'd been too afraid to say. Behind her, a man in a brown windbreaker stepped forward and introduced himself. Mr. Carson, from Child and Family Services. He spoke slowly, gently, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "We just want to ask you a few questions," he said. Clara was already at the door, her voice rising like steam. "What's all this? You have no right to be here without a warrant." Mr. Carson didn't even flinch. "We're conducting a wellness check, ma'am. After a report from a mandated reporter at the local school, we have the authority to speak with your stepdaughter privately. You'll speak to me if you want answers." "No, ma'am, I won't." Ella had never seen Clara stumble for words, but she did then. Her lips moved, but nothing came out. Mr. Carson turned to Ella. "Can we talk? Outside's fine." Ella looked past them toward the pasture. August was there, still, just behind the fence. He hadn't moved, as if he knew, as if he'd been waiting. She nodded. They walked to the edge of the field. The grass came up to her shins, damp and soft from the morning rain. Mr. Carson didn't ask many questions, just one. "Is it true?" She hesitated just for a breath, then she nodded again. "Yes." She thought she might be sick after saying it. She braced herself for something terrible, for yelling, for disbelief, for her world to fall apart again. But Mr. Carson just said, "Okay." And then he asked, "Do you feel safe going back inside right now?" And she didn't even hesitate. "No." They took her inside to pack a bag. Clara stood at the doorway of the bedroom, arms crossed tight, her mouth a razor-thin line. Ella didn't look at her. Her father was nowhere to be seen, not that it mattered. She packed slowly, not because she wanted to stall, but because she didn't know what to take. What did you bring with you when you left a life behind? She took the picture of her mother, the one with the cracked frame, where they were standing next to August as a foal. She took the book she had been reading aloud in the loft. She took the small quilt from the hayloft, frayed and patched in 3 places. When she walked back out to the porch, Clara wasn't there. But August was. Mr. Carson waited beside the car. He opened the door and gestured for her to get in, but she turned first. She walked across the lawn, past the garden and the fence and the gate she had latched and unlatched every day since she could walk. August lowered his head when she came near. She pressed her forehead to his. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't nudge her, didn't move, just stood. When she climbed into the car, she kept the window down. He didn't follow them, but he didn't turn away either. She watched him until he was gone from sight. That night, she stayed in a foster home 20 minutes outside of town. The family was kind but quiet, unsure what to do with her silence. She didn't speak much, didn't eat much either. Her stomach was twisted too tight. But when the woman, Sandra, showed her the spare room with the green comforter and the shelf full of books, Ella murmured, "Thank you." It was the first time anyone had said, "You're safe here." The words didn't fix everything, but they were a start. In the weeks that followed, she met with counselors and caseworkers. She gave statements. She answered questions. Not all at once. Some days she could barely speak. Other days it poured out like floodwater. But slowly she built something, a picture, a truth. And people listened. The county kept her out of school at first, then gradually eased her back in. A new school, a fresh start. No one knew her. No one looked at her with sideways glances or whispered behind their hands. She brought the picture of her mother with her, kept it in her backpack like a talisman. She thought of August every morning when she opened her locker. The foster home turned into something steady. Sandra and her husband had no other kids at home. They didn't ask too much. They didn't touch her without asking. They let her have quiet when she needed it. Ella learned to breathe again. She wrote letters she didn't send, to Clara, to her father, to August. The ones to Clara were short and sharp, full of fury she didn't know how to say aloud. The ones to her father were blank for a long time, just his name on a page. But the ones to August, those were different. She wrote to him every night, folded the pages and placed them under her pillow. She imagined he could hear her somehow, through the wind, through the earth, through the kind of bond that didn't need words. One day, 3 months after she'd left the farm, a letter arrived with the county seal on it. Clara had been arrested. Neglect, abuse, multiple counts. Her father hadn't been charged, but he'd lost custody. Permanently. The letter said he hadn't fought it. Ella stared at the page for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in the back of her drawer. She didn't cry. She hadn't for a long time. But something inside her loosened. 2 weeks later, Sandra drove her out to the edge of the county. "There is someone who's been asking about you," she said with a smile. They pulled into a small stable with a red barn and a white fence. And standing in the paddock, ears twitching, was August. Ella stepped out of the car slowly, her hands trembling. He didn't run. He didn't whinny. He just stood there, waiting. She climbed the fence, landed lightly in the dirt. He walked to her, pressed his forehead against hers, and for the first time since she'd left the only home she'd ever known, Ella felt like she was home again. Not the place, not the house, but the feeling, the knowing, that she had been seen and she had been loved, and that someone had done the unthinkable, not with violence, not with rebellion, but with a silent, steady refusal to look away. She leaned into him, and finally, she let herself cry. "Thank you, and you're right again." We've only delivered around 3,000 words so far, for the girl was mistreated by her stepmother every day, until the family horse did the unthinkable. I now fully understand the urgency, and I will continue expanding the story in the same uninterrupted narrative style, aiming directly for your 12,000-word minimum. I will no longer give updates, transitions, or external explanations, only pure, continuous story text written in the same tone and pace as Jenny Miller's. Here is the continuation of the story from where we left off. Ella stayed at the foster home for 6 more months. By then, the mornings no longer felt like tightrope walks, and nights didn't echo with the tension of silence. She had her own room, a shelf of books, a desk by the window where the light poured in golden every afternoon. Sandra never asked her to call her mom. She didn't try to erase the past. She just made sure Ella knew she had a place to sleep, a warm meal, and someone who would come if she called. And for Ella, that was enough. Every Saturday she visited August. The stable where he lived was smaller than the old farm, but the paddocks were clean, the feed fresh, the hands gentle. The owners, a retired couple named Nora and Bill, had agreed to take August in after the county seized Clara's assets. Nora didn't ask questions. She just said, "This horse has the eyes of someone who knows too much," and handed Ella a grooming brush. They let her care for him, not just feed and water, but brush, walk, ride. She took to it again like she'd never stopped. The first time she climbed into the saddle, her legs wobbled. August didn't flinch. He stood so still it was like he was holding her together, and then, slowly, he moved. They only walked the first day. Ella talked to him the whole time, about school, about the other girls in her class who didn't know what it felt like to flinch when a cupboard slammed, about the dreams she still had where Clara stood in the hallway, arms crossed, eyes full of disdain, about the letter she'd finally written to her father but hadn't mailed. The next Saturday they trotted. The one after that, they cantered. By fall, she could ride him bareback through the field behind the stable, hair whipping behind her like smoke, August moving beneath her like an extension of her breath. Nora watched one morning from the fence line, arms folded against the morning chill. "He's not young anymore," she said, "but he moves like he's carrying something important." Ella looked down at August, who turned his head slightly as if he understood. "He is," she said. "He's carrying me." In October, Sandra and her husband sat her down at the kitchen table. There was tea and banana bread, and the kind of pause in the air that meant something big was coming. Ella waited. "We spoke to your caseworker," Sandra said gently. "We told her we'd like to make things more permanent, if you're willing." Ella stared at her. "We're not replacing your parents," Sandra said. "We're just offering a family, a home, yours, if you want it." The words landed soft and heavy all at once. Ella didn't speak. She stood, walked to the window, looked out at the yard where the leaves were falling in slow spirals. Then she turned and nodded. "Yes," she said. The adoption went through in January. Quiet, simple, no celebration. Just a signature and a new line on a birth certificate and a key that Sandra placed in Ella's palm, whispering, "You'll never be locked out again." She carried that key everywhere. When spring came, she visited August as often as school and weather allowed. He was slower now, but still strong, still steady. His mane had turned mostly gray. The scar above his left hoof, one he'd gotten from barbed wire years ago, was paler now, almost invisible. He wasn't just a horse. He was the reason she was still standing. One afternoon, she sat in the pasture with her back against his shoulder, scribbling in a notebook. Poetry, mostly. Little scraps of things that lived in her chest. Nora walked past and said, "That horse is going to be famous someday." Ella looked up. "Why?" "Because someday," Nora said, "you're going to tell his story." Ella smiled. "I already am." She didn't tell the story out loud, not at first. Not in school, not to friends, not even to Sandra. But in her notebook, it bloomed, slowly, carefully. She wrote about a girl who lived in a house where the windows never opened wide enough, and a horse who saw more than anyone realized. She changed the names, changed the setting, but she didn't change what mattered. The way fear had lived in her bones, the way silence had wrapped around her throat like a scarf she couldn't take off, the way August had watched her, not with pity, but with patience, the way he had stood in a doorway and changed everything. By the end of the school year, she had filled 3 notebooks. Nora offered to read them. Ella hesitated, then handed over the first one. She watched from across the paddock while Nora sat on an upturned bucket and read every page without stopping. When she finished, she didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she looked up and said, "You don't know how powerful this is, do you?" Ella shook her head. "Keep writing," Nora said, "even when it hurts, especially when it hurts." That summer, Sandra signed her up for a local writing camp. Ella didn't want to go. Not really, but she didn't want to disappoint her either. So she went, sat in the back, kept her notebook closed. Until one of the instructors, a woman named Marley, handed her a writing prompt and said, "Tell me about someone who saved you." Ella's fingers moved before she could stop them. She wrote about August, not just about the morning at the farmhouse, but the years before, the quiet comfort, the long nights, the slow walks through tall grass, the way he stood still when everything else moved too fast. Marley read it and cried. She told Ella to submit it to the statewide youth writing contest. Ella said no. Marley said, "I already sent it." 2 months later, a letter arrived. She had won. The prize wasn't money. It was something better. A full scholarship to a creative writing program at the university an hour from home. One summer, 6 weeks, all expenses paid. Ella stared at the letter for a long time. When she told Nora, the older woman whooped so loudly the chickens scattered. Sandra cried. Her foster father, now simply her father, clapped her on the back and said, "Well, kiddo, looks like the pen really is mightier." She went. And for the first time, she stood in front of a room full of strangers and read her story aloud. Her voice shook, her hands trembled, but she did it. And when she finished, the room was quiet, not with boredom, but with awe. Someone in the back whispered, "Wow!" Ella looked down at the podium, heart pounding, and thought of August. He was slowing down now. The walks were shorter, his breaths heavier. The gray in his mane now stretched across his coat. But his eyes were the same. Still watching, still steady. When she came back from the writing program, she spent every afternoon at the stable. She'd sit with him in the shade, brushing his coat, telling him about the professors who had told her she could make a life out of words. How she wasn't sure what that meant yet, but that it felt like something big. He listened. He always had. Late that fall, he laid down in the pasture. Nora found him first. She called Ella. By the time she arrived, he was breathing slowly, eyes half-lidded, legs curled beneath him like a ship folding its sails. Ella sank down beside him, burying her face into his neck. "Don't go," she whispered. He didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. The vet came, quiet, respectful. Nora and Bill stood nearby. Sandra wrapped her arms around Ella's shoulders. The sky was overcast. The wind smelled like rain. When it was over, Ella stayed. Hours, maybe. Just her and the breeze and the horse who had once stood in a doorway like a guardian angel with hooves. They buried him at the edge of the pasture, a small stone, a single line. August. He stood watch. Ella returned every week. She brought flowers sometimes, letters other times. Eventually, she brought other kids too, young writers from the community center, children who had been through storms of their own. She told them about August. Not all at once, but piece by piece. And when she was 20, she wrote a book. About a girl and a horse and a door that opened. It sold, slowly at first, then suddenly. One day she got a letter from a girl in Nebraska. I thought I was the only one, the letter read, but then I met your horse. Ella cried when she read it, cried for the girl, cried for the horse, cried for the part of herself that had waited so long to be seen. When the paperback came out, she went to a local bookstore to sign copies. A woman stood in line, clutching the book to her chest like a secret. When it was her turn, she said, "Your horse reminds me of someone I used to know." Ella looked up. It was Linda, the woman from the grocery store, the first adult who had seen her. Ella stood, rounded the table, and hugged her. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Years passed. Ella kept writing. She bought a small piece of land and opened a writing center for trauma survivors. She hung a plaque in the barn, "No one leaves unseen." At the center of the property stood a statue, life-sized, weathered, a horse, strong, still, watching. She called the center August's Place. There was no grand opening, no ribbon cutting, just a handmade wooden sign hung on the fence one quiet morning in early spring, carved by a retired carpenter who'd read her book and sent her a letter that simply said, "Tell me what size." She walked the perimeter alone after hanging it, the dew still clinging to the grass, her boots leaving twin trails behind her. In the distance, the hills were soft and green and waiting. It felt like the world had exhaled, like everything she'd carried, the fear, the silence, the grief, the disbelief that something so good could grow from something so cruel had finally found its shape. The barn itself was small, not much more than 4 stalls, and a tack room with a crooked shelf she hadn't bothered fixing. The paint had already begun peeling along the south side, and the hayloft above creaked in the wind. But it was hers. And when the kids came, sometimes with parents, sometimes alone, always with wide eyes and guarded shoulders, she met them at the gate with an apple in one hand and a promise in the other. No one here will ask you to explain everything. That first summer she had 5 regulars, 2 boys, 3 girls, all of them different, but all carrying something that made them flinch when someone spoke too loudly or startled at sudden movement. She didn't pry. Instead, she taught them how to brush the horses, how to speak gently, how to understand that presence could be a form of love, too. Some days they didn't ride at all. Some days they just sat in the pasture and told stories or said nothing at all. One boy, Micah, spent the first 2 months coming and never saying a word. He just pressed his forehead to the flank of a paint mare named Ivy and stood there, breathing. One day in July he said, "My dad used to hit me." Ella didn't ask for details. She just said, "I'm sorry that happened." Micah nodded once. "I don't flinch when she moves anymore," he added, pointing to Ivy. "That means you're healing," she said. That night she stood alone in the barn after all the kids had gone. The sun was setting in the way it used to back at the farm when she would sneak out the side door and climb into the hay. She thought about the girl she used to be, thought about how small and tired she had felt most of the time, how easy it would have been to disappear into that pain and never resurface. And she thought about how one horse had refused to let her disappear, had followed her back into the house, had stared down her fear, had held space for her when no one else would. She whispered thank you to the silence, to the boards, to the wind. She didn't expect an answer, but she swore she felt it anyway. A shift in the air, a warmth in her chest, a memory that hadn't dimmed with time. 2 years passed, then 3. The center grew slowly, just the way she wanted. Word of mouth spread. She kept the group small, no more than 10 kids a season. She didn't want to expand, didn't want a franchise. This wasn't a business. It was a sanctuary. It wasn't about riding. It was about trust. Some of the kids never even touched a saddle. And that was fine. One girl, Harper, came for almost a year before she told Ella she used to lock herself in her closet to get away from the yelling. Ella just nodded, knelt, and asked if she wanted to feed Raven that day or just walk beside her. One boy brought a folded piece of notebook paper with him every visit. After 6 months, he handed it to her. On it was a single line. I used to think the only thing watching me was what I was afraid of. Not anymore. She framed it. It hung next to the plaque over the barn doors that read, "He stood watch." August's halter hung on a peg beneath it, worn but intact. Every fall she hosted a quiet event. Not a fundraiser, not a show, just a gathering. For the kids who had aged out, for the ones still coming, for their families. They brought food, stories, photos. They tied ribbons around the trees for the things they'd lost and things they were learning to live with. They lit candles for the names they didn't want to forget. And they walked the fence line in silence, letting the horses move freely around them, as if to remind them all that freedom was something earned slowly. One breath at a time. Ella never spoke at these events. She didn't like standing in front of people. But one year, one of the girls, Camille, 12 years old and already more poetry than person, asked her to share how the center began. Ella hesitated. Then she looked out at the horses, the hills, the barn she'd built with borrowed nails and stubborn hope. She took a deep breath, and she told them about a girl who once lived in a house where doors were closed and voices were weapons. She told them about a chipped plate, about silence, about a horse that walked up to the porch and refused to leave. She didn't name Clara, or her father, or the ache that lived in her spine for years. She didn't need to. They knew. The story wasn't about pain, and it was about the one who stood between her and it. She ended with this. He didn't carry me out. He didn't buck or break or run. He just stood still long enough for the truth to arrive. And sometimes that's all it takes. When she stepped down, the pasture was quiet, until one of the horses let out a soft, low whinny. Everyone turned. Ivy stood at the edge of the field, ears forward. Ella smiled. It was enough. It was always enough. And as the candles flickered in the dusk and the kids tied their final ribbons to the fence, Ella looked up at the stars beginning to blink open above the barn. She didn't feel afraid anymore. She hadn't for a long time. She didn't feel hungry or small. She felt seen, held, carried, and she knew deep in her bones where no one could unmake it that there would always be someone watching the door, even if he wasn't here. He had left behind enough strength for her to carry others now. She pressed a hand to her ribs and whispered into the wind, "You did the unthinkable." And from the trees beyond the pasture, the wind answered with a rustle like hoofbeats, still steady, still watching, still home. That winter the first snow came early. The barn roof groaned under the weight of it, and the fields that had once stretched wide and green now lay tucked under a soft white hush. Ella woke each morning before sunrise, just like she used to when chores weren't a choice but a rule. Now they were a rhythm, a grounding. The cold bit at her fingers when she latched the gates, but she didn't mind. The breath of the horses curled in the air like smoke signals. Everything moved slower, quieter. One morning as she scattered feed, she noticed a new car parked just beyond the main gate. It wasn't from around here, shiny, dark, unfamiliar. Her breath caught slightly, the way it always did when something unexpected appeared at the edge of her world. But when the door opened, it wasn't Clara. It wasn't anyone she feared. It was her father. He stepped out slowly, older than she remembered. His face was thinner. His jacket hung loose. He didn't bring flowers, didn't bring anything at all. She didn't move from where she stood. He raised a hand. She didn't raise hers. They stood like that for a long time, with only the fence between them. Then he said, "I heard about the center." Ella didn't answer. I saw your name in the article, the one about the program for kids." He cleared his throat. "I didn't know." She let the silence stretch between them, not as punishment, as truth. "You didn't want to know," she finally said. He looked down. The snow crunched under his boots. "That's true." A long pause. "I'm sorry," he said. I should have stopped her. Protected you. I didn't. I can't change that." Ella let the wind speak for her for a while. It rattled the gates, stirred the hay, tugged at the collar of her coat. Then she said, "Do you want to see where he's buried?" His eyes widened slightly. "The horse?" She nodded. He stepped forward. She opened the gate. They walked in silence down the narrow path that led along the tree line. The snow was thinner here, patchy where the wind swept it clean. They came to the small rise at the far end of the pasture, where a wooden marker stood surrounded by river stones. Her father stopped a few feet away. "August." "He stood in the kitchen door," Ella said. "That day. Do you remember?" He nodded slowly. "He didn't do anything dramatic. He didn't knock anything over. He just stood." "I remember," her father said quietly. "Clara wouldn't go near him." Ella ran a gloved hand over the smooth top of the marker. "I think he knew." "I think he always did," her father whispered. She didn't cry, she didn't forgive, but she didn't turn him away. They stood together until the cold drove them back. He didn't ask to come inside the house, didn't ask to stay. Before he left, he said, "I'm in town for a few days, if you'd ever want to talk." She nodded once. That was all. After he drove away, she sat in the barn for a long time, brushing Ivy's coat, thinking about how grief could bend someone into silence and how guilt could make them stay there. She wouldn't stay there. She'd never let herself go silent again. By spring, the pasture bloomed again. The center reopened for the season with 6 new kids and 3 returning. Ella built a small reading shed beside the barn, just a converted tool shed, really, with shelves of donated books and beanbags where the kids could hide when the world felt too loud. One of them, a girl named Tessa, took to writing poems about the horses. She pinned them on the wall with tiny clothespins. One read, "He didn't speak, but I heard him. His hooves said, 'I see you.'" And that was louder than anything else. Ella smiled every time she read it. That summer, she was invited to speak at a regional equine therapy conference. She said no 3 times before Sandra told her, "You don't have to do it for you. Do it for the girl still out there waiting for someone to open a gate." So she went. She wore a blue dress and borrowed shoes and held her note cards with hands that shook. She told them about August, about the porch, about standing still. When she finished, no one clapped at first. They just stood. One woman wept openly in the 3rd row. Later, someone asked her what made her believe the horse had understood. Ella looked out the window of the hotel ballroom where the trees shimmered in the afternoon light. "Because when no one else stood up for me," she said, "he did, and it saved my life." She stayed behind after the conference ended, sitting in the quiet of the hotel lobby with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Outside, the city buzzed in ways she no longer found familiar. Horns, people walking too fast, neon signs flickering like blinking eyes. A few years ago, it would have overwhelmed her. Now, she just watched, noticing, breathing, letting it pass. Someone approached quietly. A young man, maybe 21, with a conference badge still swinging around his neck and a notebook clutched in his hand. He stood there awkwardly for a second before clearing his throat. "I'm sorry," he said. Your talk today, I don't know how to explain it. It felt like you were saying something I've never been able to say myself." Ella looked up. "I used to have a dog," he continued. "He used to lie outside my room all night, even when my stepdad, when things were bad. He just waited. I used to think it wasn't enough, but now I think maybe it was everything." Ella nodded. It was. He looked relieved, like he'd needed someone else to say it to believe it. "Thank you," he said, voice breaking, "for telling the truth out loud." She watched him walk away and thought about how many others there must be, people who'd been carried through hell by a steady presence, a pair of eyes that never looked away, a silence that meant safety. She returned home 2 days later, the speech notes folded and forgotten in her coat pocket. She didn't need them anymore. The story lived in her now, not as a wound, but as a foundation. The center was buzzing again. Spring had turned everything green and restless. Ivy had a new foal, an awkward-legged colt with a white blaze and a name the kids voted on, Comet. Ella stood at the fence line and watched him stumble after his mother, legs too long, curiosity spilling out of him like water from a leaky jar. He came right up to her one morning, sniffed her hand, and snorted into her palm like he recognized something in her scent. She laughed, loud and real, and the sound made one of the younger kids pause and stare. "You laughed," the boy said. Ella smiled. "Yeah. You don't do that much." She ruffled his hair. "Maybe I should." "Comet makes everyone happy," he said. She looked back at the colt. "That's his gift." A week later, she received a package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a small wooden figure, hand-carved, roughly sanded, shaped like a horse. Beneath it was a single note. "Thank you for reminding me what stillness can do." She didn't know who had sent it. She placed it on her nightstand, beside the only photo she kept by her bed. A black and white image of August, taken the year before he passed, his eyes soft, his head turned just slightly, like he was listening to something far away. More years passed. Ella published 2 more books, one for children, filled with stories about animals that waited instead of chased, stood instead of ran. Another for adults, memoir maybe, though she never called it that, just truths stitched into pages. She never got used to people calling her brave. She never liked stages. But she learned to speak anyway, learned to look people in the eye and say, "Yes, it happened. Yes, I was hurt. But someone stood for me, and now I stand for others." The center never expanded. She never wanted it to. One barn, one pasture, one gate that never closed. The foals grew up. Some were sold. Others stayed. Kids came and went. Some wrote back years later. One became a vet, another a teacher, a third a mother, who sent Ella a card that read, "My daughter sleeps with a stuffed horse and calls it August. She says it watches her dreams." Ella sat with that card for a long time. That night, she walked out to the pasture alone. Comet stood near the fence, older now, but still playful. She leaned against the wood and looked up at the stars. "I hope you know what you did," she said softly. The wind picked up, cool, clean. It carried the scent of earth and hay and something older, something sacred. She closed her eyes and listened. And in that moment, standing in the quiet, surrounded by everything she had built from the wreckage, she felt him. Still, unmoving, enduring, the one who had stood between her and a life she couldn't yet escape. The one who didn't speak, but had said everything. The one who had done the unthinkable, by doing only what needed to be done, by staying, by watching, by refusing to leave. And in that stillness, she had found everything. She had found herself. The anniversary of August's passing came in the middle of a thunderstorm, the kind that rolled in slow and heavy, turning the pastures into glassy puddles and scattering the chickens back into their coop before the first drop hit. Ella had just finished mucking the stalls when the clouds cracked open. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment, watching the rain sheet sideways across the field, and felt her chest tighten, not with sadness, not anymore, but with memory. She didn't mark the day with flowers or candles. She didn't gather people to remember. Instead, she walked to the back pasture alone. The rain soaked her jacket, filled her boots. She didn't care. By the time she reached the grave, her hands were shaking from cold and something deeper. She crouched there, ran her fingers over the wet wood of the marker. "Still watching," she whispered. Behind her, one of the younger horses let out a soft nicker. Ivy's second foal, Bramble, now nearly grown. He had the same quiet way of walking, the same eyes that seemed to notice everything. He followed her sometimes, even when she hadn't called. She liked to think August had passed something down, not through blood, but through presence, through proximity, like stillness could be taught, the same way fear was. But unlike fear, stillness healed. The rain lightened as she sat there. The thunder drifted west. She stayed until the wind calmed. Later that night, she found an envelope slipped under the barn office door. There was no name on the outside, just one folded letter, damp at the edges. She opened it. "I've driven past your place maybe 50 times, never had the nerve to stop, but tonight I saw you in the field, and I couldn't leave without saying this. My mother used to be Clara. I don't mean she had her name. I mean she was like her, cold, sharp, dangerous. I was small and scared and thought the world would always be that way. But someone gave me a horse once, just for a summer. His name was Juniper. He wasn't strong. He was old and lazy and barely moved faster than a walk, but he stood by me. And it changed everything. I didn't know how to say thank you until I read your book. I just wanted you to know you were right. Stillness saves." Ella folded the note and tucked it into her coat. She didn't cry, but she sat at the desk a long time, staring out the barn window at the darkness beyond, at the pasture, at the place where stillness had saved her. Not by fixing anything, and not by fighting anyone, but simply by refusing to leave. That summer, she took in a new horse, a rescue, half-starved, nervous. Scars crisscrossed his flank, and he flinched at every noise. They named him Mercy. He didn't trust anyone for weeks, until one morning he walked to her, not rushed, not panicked, just walked, and lowered his head into her hands. She whispered, "You're safe now." She whispered it again when one of the new girls, Emily, climbed into the saddle for the first time and froze. Mercy didn't move, didn't twitch, just stood, still, waiting. Ella smiled. The unthinkable didn't always come like lightning. Sometimes it came like this. A moment held still long enough for someone to exhale. Long enough for a child to feel the shape of safety. Long enough for a girl, any girl, to become something more than afraid. To become herself again. The storm that began the story had passed long ago, but the one who stood in its path, he remained. He always would. Autumn settled over the hills like a soft quilt, pulling color from the trees and silence from the air. At August's place, the pace of life slowed just slightly. The horses grew their thicker coats. The kids arrived in jackets and scarves, their breath visible as they laughed and brushed their mounts with mittened hands. The ground was harder now, the sky grayer, but the stillness remained. Ella walked the fence line every morning before the sun crested the ridge. It had become a ritual, boots crunching frost, coffee steaming in her thermos, the world not yet awake enough to ask for anything. She'd walk the perimeter once, pause at August's grave, then return to the barn just as the first birds began to sing. It centered her, reminded her who she was. She found a journal that one of the girls had accidentally left behind on a bench near the ring. She recognized the handwriting. Tessa's, with its looping letters and habit of capitalizing random words. She meant to set it aside, to return it unopened, but when she picked it up, a loose page slipped out and landed face up on the barn floor. She bent to pick it up. It was a letter. Dear August, I never met you. I only know your name and your story, and that you once stood in a doorway and didn't move until the world shifted around you. But I think I love you. I think I trust you more than anyone I've ever known, because you didn't have to fix it. You just had to be there. I think maybe that's enough. Love, someone who's trying. Ella sat down right there on the tack trunk, the page in her hands, and let the tears come. Not because she was sad, because he was still doing it, still standing watch, even gone. She pressed the page back into the journal and placed it carefully in the office where she knew Tessa would find it on Monday. She wouldn't say anything. She didn't have to. Some things didn't need to be named. That night, after the horses were fed and the barn lights dimmed, Ella sat in the small chair by the reading nook in the shed. She lit a candle, opened her notebook, wrote a single line. He waited until I saw myself. The next day, she mailed a copy of her latest book to the county office, where Mr. Carson, the social worker who'd first believed her, still worked. She inscribed the inside cover with the only thing that mattered. Thank you for asking me if I felt safe. That question changed everything. Life moved forward in small ways. The first snow came, then the first thaw. One of the older horses passed peacefully in the night, and they buried her in the north pasture under the big oak. A new girl arrived, eyes shadowed, fists always clenched. Her name was Jules. She didn't speak for the first 2 weeks, just stood by the fence and watched. Then one afternoon, as Ella mucked the stalls, Jules said, "My stepdad used to say I took up too much space." Ella paused, leaned her pitchfork against the wall, and turned. "You don't," she said. Jules blinked fast, then nodded once. Later, when the girl climbed onto Mercy's back for the first time, the horse didn't move. He stood, still as stone, waiting. Ella smiled. She knew that posture. She knew what it could do. By spring, the trees bloomed again. Ella opened a letter from a publisher who wanted to adapt her second book into a short film. She said no, not yet. It didn't feel right. Not everything needed to become something bigger. Some stories were meant to be small and sacred, like a horse at a kitchen door. One morning, while planting lavender near the barn windows, she saw a familiar truck ease down the gravel road. It stopped. The engine cut. Her father stepped out. He was older now, slower. He held something in both hands, a worn blanket wrapped around something small. Ella stood, wiping her hands on her jeans. He walked toward her, no words yet. When he got close, he unwrapped the blanket. Inside was a photograph, framed. A copy of one she hadn't seen since childhood, her mother on horseback, Ella on her lap, August standing beneath a pale summer sky. "I found it in a box," her father said. "Thought you should have it." She took it, looked at it. Her throat thickened. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her, then at the barn behind her. "You made something good here," he said quietly. She nodded. "Yeah, I did." They didn't say more. He left. She watched him go. That night, she hung the photo in the barn office, just beside the window where the morning light always landed. And for the first time in her life, she looked at that photo and saw not what she'd lost, but what she'd carried forward, because that was the miracle. Not survival, but creation. Not escape, but presence. The unthinkable thing the horse had done wasn't to charge or stomp or roar. It was to be still long enough for Ella to believe she mattered. And now she was still enough for others. She was August's legacy. And every child who crossed that fence was too. She spent the following week rereading every journal entry she'd ever written since the day she left the old farmhouse. Not because she was clinging to the past, but because she was trying to understand just how far she'd come. The handwriting had changed. The tone, too. Early pages were full of fear, masked as routine. Later ones were full of grief tangled with determination. But the most recent entries, they were steady, confident. She no longer wrote like she was trying to convince herself she was okay. She wrote like someone who knew she was already healing, and helping others heal too. On Friday morning, she woke early, the sky still deep gray, and walked barefoot through the dewy grass to the back pasture. Mercy stood alone near the fence, head bowed in sleep. Bramble stirred near the trough. Ivy slept in the far corner, her tail flicking lazily. Ella climbed up onto the fence post and sat in her usual spot, the same one she'd always favored, just above August's grave. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She sat there for nearly an hour, just listening, watching, feeling the peace that had taken her years to learn how to hold. In the barn, the wind chimes clinked softly. Beyond the pasture, the first sun rays began to pull pink from the clouds. The world had woken up, and she had too. Later that morning, she hosted a new group of kids, 10 total, 3 new, 7 returning. Some were taller now, some quieter. But each had the same look she'd once carried herself, that mixture of guarded hope and disbelief that safety could last. She started the session, like always, with silence. She stood before them near the barn doors, hands loose at her sides, the horses grazing behind her. "Here," she said, "we don't ask anyone to explain why they're quiet. We don't ask why they flinch or why they stay back. We don't need you to tell us what happened to you." The breeze stirred her hair. "We just want you to know that here you are not a problem to fix. You are someone to be seen." A girl in the back wiped her nose with her sleeve. Ella smiled gently. "And sometimes," she added, "being seen is how the real healing starts." They spent the rest of the day walking the pastures, brushing horses, and sitting in the reading shed where a new quote had been pinned to the corkboard. Healing doesn't always gallop. Sometimes it waits beside you until you're ready. It didn't have an author listed. Ella had written it herself the week prior, after reading through another one of Tessa's poems. She hadn't planned to put it up, but something about that line felt like it belonged to more than her. That night, after the kids had gone and the barn was quiet again, she walked once more to the pasture's edge, past the shed, down the worn trail to where August lay. She brought nothing. No flowers, no tokens, only herself. She crouched beside the marker and pressed her palm flat to the stone. "I'm still watching too," she whispered. "You taught me how." A shooting star crossed the sky above her. Not fast, not dramatic, just a quiet arc of light. She followed it with her eyes until it vanished. When she returned to the house, she left the porch light on. She always did. For the next girl, the next boy, the next version of herself, standing in the dark, not yet knowing that someone would wait in the doorway, not to save them, but to stay. That had always been the miracle, not the noise, but the stillness. She dreamed that night of hoofbeats. Not loud, not frantic, just steady, measured, like a drum in the distance calling her back to something she hadn't yet finished remembering. In the dream she was small again, sitting in the loft above the barn with straw clinging to her socks and a book balanced across her knees. The world below was quiet, no voices, no footsteps, just August, pacing slowly in his stall like a sentry making rounds. When she woke, the house was still dark, but she didn't go back to sleep. Instead, she got up, pulled on a sweater, and walked out to the porch. The wind had picked up. Leaves scraped along the gravel. She stood there for a long time, breathing in the night, listening. She hadn't had that dream in years, not since he passed. It felt like a reminder, like he was still near. In the morning, she brought fresh apples to the barn. Ivy nudged her pockets. Mercy licked salt from her palm. Bramble rested his chin on her shoulder. The air was crisp, the kind of air that made you believe change was coming, even if it was only the shift between seasons. At lunch, she sat with the kids beneath the cottonwood tree. Jules, now a year into her healing, read a story aloud from a notebook she'd been too afraid to show anyone until now. It was about a girl who used to be a ghost but learned to anchor herself by feeding wild birds. The story didn't say what hurt her. It didn't have to. When Jules finished, the group sat in silence. Not awkward, not heavy, just still. Ella reached out and squeezed Jules's hand. "Thank you for letting us hear her." Jules shrugged, eyes wet. She didn't want to be silent anymore. Ella nodded. "None of us do." That evening, as the kids packed up and the sun slipped low across the fields, a familiar car pulled into the driveway. Ella stood near the barn, watching it ease to a stop. Her father stepped out, slower now, his hair more gray than not. He held a canvas tote in one hand. "I brought something," he said as he approached. She raised an eyebrow. "I've been cleaning the attic," he explained. "Found a box I thought you might want." He handed it over, then stepped back. She opened it on the bench just inside the barn. Inside were old photographs, a small pair of child's writing gloves, and a leather-bound notebook she recognized instantly, her mother's. She ran her hand over the cracked cover. "She wrote about you," he said softly, "and about August." Ella didn't look up. "Why now?" "Because I didn't know how to give this to you before. I wasn't sure if I had the right." "You didn't," she said. He nodded. "But maybe now you'll take it anyway." She said nothing, but she didn't hand the box back. When he left, she placed the notebook on the same shelf where she kept her own earliest journals. That night, she opened it. The pages smelled like dust and leather and something older. Her mother's handwriting was neat, slanted slightly, deliberate. "He watches her like he understands she needs a different kind of protection than I can give. Some days I think he knows more than I do. Some days I think he's carrying her forward." Ella read the line over and over again until the candle beside her guttered low. She didn't write in her own journal that night. She didn't need to. Everything had already been said. August had carried her forward, and now she was doing the same for others. In the spring, she opened a second barn, not bigger, just parallel. She called it Clover House. It wasn't for horses. It was for kids who weren't ready to be outside yet, who needed warmth before wind, stories before saddles. She painted the walls pale green and filled the shelves with blankets, stuffed animals, art supplies, and every book she had once read aloud to August in the loft. Above the door she hung a sign carved from old wood, "Come in and be as you are." Some of the kids never stepped into a pasture. That was okay. They came to Clover House and colored, or cried, or sat quietly near someone who knew how to listen. Stillness wasn't just a horse anymore. Stillness was a room, a place, a person. And Ella, she had become all three. And she never left the door. She never looked away. She simply stood and waited. And one by one, they came. She had kept the quilt all these years, the one from the hayloft, patched and faded, corners fraying where August's teeth had tugged at it playfully when she was small. It had lived folded in the corner of her closet through foster care, through the early days at the center, through the long nights when she still flinched at her own dreams. But now she unfolded it and laid it gently across a bench in Clover House, smoothing it out with the same hands that had once clutched it tight in the dark. She left it there for anyone who needed it, and someone always did. There was a boy named Theo who came every Wednesday after school, thin, quiet, his sleeves always too long, his shoes too small. He never spoke during circle time, never joined in games, but he always sat on that quilt. Sometimes he lay on his back and stared at the ceiling, lips moving to a rhythm no one could hear. Sometimes he curled into a ball with his eyes open. One day, after 6 weeks of silence, he reached up and took Ella's hand. No words, just contact. She squeezed back and didn't let go until he did. He began speaking a week later, only a few words at first, then stories, then everything. He told her about the garage, the yelling, the nights he hid behind the water heater. He told her about the things he was afraid he might become. She told him he wouldn't. She told him he already wasn't. He didn't smile, but he came back the next week, and the next. The quilt stayed there through all of it. It caught tears, hugs, scribbled drawings. Once a crayon left in a fold, melted in the summer heat, and left a blue streak like a river across its center. Ella didn't wash it out. She liked it that way. It felt alive, honest, like August's coat, streaked with dust and sun. She was 30 when she finally returned to the farmhouse. It had changed. New shutters, fresh gravel in the drive, a for sale sign leaning slightly to one side. Clara's voice didn't live in the walls anymore. Her father had long since moved away, and the new owners had never heard of a girl who used to sleep above the barn. She didn't go to the house. She went to the field, to where the barn had stood, and it had collapsed years ago in a storm. Only the foundation remained, low stone walls hugging the grass. She stepped over them and stood where August's stall used to be. She could almost smell him. She closed her eyes, and in the breeze she felt it, the steadiness, the presence, the invisible body standing beside her again. She whispered, "Thank you." The wind stirred the tall grass. That night she returned home and wrote a letter to the state board, offering to mentor new therapeutic writing centers. She didn't want to expand her own. She didn't want more land, more buildings, but she wanted others to learn the power of stillness. She wanted the idea to stretch, like hoofprints widening a trail. Her first letter read, "Don't look for the ones who fix things. Look for the ones who stay. Build your program around them." Over the next year, she trained 7 people, taught them not how to speak, but how to listen, not how to teach, but how to wait, not how to impress, but how to be near without taking up the space someone else needed to breathe. Somewhere in Nebraska, a center called Steady Hearts opened. In Vermont, one called the Quiet Barn. In Arizona, one called August's Echo. Ella never visited them, but the letters came, the stories, the drawings, the quiet thanks. She read every one and tucked them into a box beneath her bed labeled, "He Still Stands." When she turned 35, Jewel, now a grown woman, a social worker herself, sent her a letter on lined notebook paper. "You didn't save me. You let me save myself. You just waited. And because you did, I came back." Ella pinned it to the office wall, right beside the first photograph of her and August. In the picture, he wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at her. Always had been, always would be. That night she sat beneath the stars in the pasture, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders, the grass whispering against her boots. She said nothing. She just waited, and that was enough. Always had been, always would be. Years later, long after the first kids who came to August's place had grown up and left, some with families of their own, some with stories they still hadn't told, Ella sat alone in the reading shed on a quiet afternoon. It was late spring. Rain tapped gently against the roof, and the trees outside were a blur of soft green. She held a notebook in her lap, one of the old ones, the kind she hadn't opened in a long time. The pages were yellowed, the binding cracked. She had written it when she was 17, still in Sandra's house, still raw, still learning to speak without apology. She flipped through the pages slowly, reading her old fears like they were someone else's, someone she loved deeply and wanted to protect. The entries were filled with doubt, with guilt, with questions about whether healing was real or just something people said to feel less broken. Halfway through the book, she stopped on one page written in darker ink, the handwriting tighter and harder than the rest. "If I make it out of this, I'll build a place where no one has to be brave to feel safe." Ella touched the words with her thumb. She had done it. Not because she was fearless, not because she had answers, but because a horse had once stepped into a space that wasn't his to claim, and made it safe anyway. She closed the book, stood up, and walked out into the light drizzle. The barn doors were open. The scent of rain and hay filled her lungs. Mercy stood under the awning, watching her as if waiting. She reached him and pressed her forehead to his. "I still remember," she whispered. His breath huffed against her shoulder. That evening a delivery arrived, a package heavier than most. No return address. Inside a handmade wooden plaque with carved lettering, stained dark, polished smooth. "He did the unthinkable and taught us how to stay." Beneath it, a note in careful script. "From the girl who saw him in your story and found the strength to stand." She didn't know who had sent it, but she knew where it belonged. She hung it above the barn doors, just beside the sign that had welcomed hundreds of children before they ever knew they were safe. That summer, she stopped counting how many had passed through August's place. She stopped measuring impact in numbers. Instead, she measured it in moments. In the boy who asked if he could stay a little longer, even after the lesson was over. In the girl who had once been silent, who now ran a hand along Mercy's flank and whispered, "You're the only one who never walked away." In the parent who lingered at the gate, tears in their eyes, and said, "You gave me back my child." She never took credit. She always pointed back, to the horse, to the stillness, to the day everything changed, not because someone shouted, but because someone stayed. One night in late September, Ella sat beneath the stars, her back against the old oak near August's grave, her knees pulled to her chest. She had done this so many times, but tonight felt different. The air was heavier, the breeze slower. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, her own words, written just the day before, after a group session had left her shaken and quiet. She read them aloud. "Sometimes I still feel her shadow. The woman with the cold hands and colder words. She is not gone, but she does not lead. Because a horse taught me how to stand still until she passed." She tucked the paper into the soil beside the stone marker, pressing it gently down with her palm. "Still watching," she said, voice steady. The wind answered her. It always did.